My son tried to have me declared incompetent to get my fortune. The judge was my old army buddy. The summons arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, a stark white envelope that felt heavier than any mail I'd ever received, and it wasn't from the taxman. It bore the official seal of the county courthouse, embossed in a dark, authoritative blue. My hands, usually steady from years of managing my own considerable investments, trembled slightly as I slid it open. Inside, the legal jargon swam before my eyes, each word a tiny, sharp accusation. It spoke of petitions, hearings, and declarations of incapacitation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was, unmistakably, a legal challenge to my mental competence. And the name listed as the petitioner? My own son, David. I sat down heavily in my favorite armchair, the one worn smooth by decades of contemplation and planning, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the Persian rug. I reread the document, disbelief warring with a cold, creeping dread. David, my only child, the one I'd poured my life and fortune into nurturing, was actively seeking to strip me of my autonomy, to brand me as unfit, to manage my own affairs. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking, a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. What had happened to the boy who used to chase fireflies in the meadow behind our old farmhouse? What had twisted his heart and mind to this point? I felt a strange calm settle over me, a steely resolve hardening in the face of this outrageous accusation. I had built my life and my wealth with a sharp mind and a diligent hand. I had faced challenges before, both in business and in life, and I would face this one too. This is the story of how a son's greed nearly succeeded, and how the enduring strength of a past loyalty saved me from ruin. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories. The summons lay on the polished mahogany desk, an unwelcome stain on the otherwise immaculate surface of my study. David's name, scrawled in the petition, felt like an indelible ink blot on the carefully constructed narrative of our family. I smoothed the document again, my fingers tracing the crisp lines of legal text that sought to dismantle my very existence as an independent being. Incapacitation. The word echoed in the cavernous silence of my home, a chilling pronouncement that felt both utterly alien and terrifyingly intimate. David. My only son. I'd always envisioned a partnership, a continuation of the legacy I'd painstakingly built. We'd shared so many dreams, so many plans, whispered over late-night brandies in this very room. He'd been present at every significant juncture of my life, a constant shadow, a reflection of my aspirations, or so I'd believed. Now, the reflection had distorted, warped into something unrecognizable, something driven by a hunger I hadn't anticipated. The sheer Machiavellian nature of his move sent a shiver down my spine. To declare me incompetent, to tie me up in legal red tape until my assets were liquidated and presumably conveniently transferred to his eager hands. It wasn't just about the money, though the fortune was substantial. It was about control. It was about the ultimate victory of his ambition over my very being. My initial reaction had been a maelstrom of disbelief and hurt, but as the shock subsided, replaced by a chilling clarity, a fierce determination ignited within me. I would not be a victim. I had fought battles on far more treacherous fields than this sterile courtroom. I had faced down hostile takeovers, weathered market crashes, and navigated the treacherous waters of international finance. This was merely another battle, albeit a far more personal and painful one. My first call was, naturally, to my attorney, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, her mind a labyrinth of legal precedent and strategic maneuvering. I'd trusted her with my business affairs for over 2 decades, and she'd never once faltered. "Eleanor," I began, my voice betraying none of the turmoil churning within me, "I've received some unpleasant news. David has filed a petition to declare me incapacitated." A beat of silence. Then, Eleanor's voice, crisp and professional, cut through the air. "Arthur, that's unexpected. Are you certain?" "As certain as I am of my own name. The summons arrived this afternoon. I faxed it over to your office. Another pause, shorter this time. I have it. This is a serious allegation, Arthur. We'll need to address it with the utmost seriousness and urgency. I expected nothing less, I replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in my tone. What are our options? Eleanor outlined the legal process, the depositions, the medical evaluations, the eventual court hearing. It was a daunting prospect, a public dissection of my life and mental faculties, but as she spoke, I could sense her own quiet fury. She'd seen firsthand the dedication and clarity I brought to my work, the meticulous planning that underscored every decision. "We will fight this, Arthur," she assured me. "We will present a robust defense. The burden of proof lies with David, and I can assure you he will find it an insurmountable obstacle." Despite Eleanor's reassurances, the weight of the situation pressed down on me. David's accusations, however baseless, would cast a shadow. I knew the legal system, and I knew that perception could often be as powerful as reality. Then, a thought, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of my anxiety. The judge. The judge assigned to this case. I'd spent a lifetime building a network, forging connections not just for business advantage, but for solidarity, for a shared understanding of the world, forged in the crucible of shared experience. A name surfaced, a memory, a ghost from a different era. General Marcus Mac O'Connell. We'd served together in Vietnam, not in the same unit, but in the same theater, our paths crossing during pivotal moments. Mac was a man of unwavering integrity, a natural leader with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. We'd stayed in touch, albeit sporadically, over the years, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the fire. I remembered him mentioning, during one of our infrequent phone calls, that he'd retired to this very county and had eventually found his way onto the bench. Could it be? Was it possible that Mac, my old comrade in arms, would be the one to preside over this, David's sordid attempt to despoil me? The thought sent a jolt of something akin to hope through me, quickly tempered by the pragmatism of my business instincts. I couldn't rely on sentiment or past associations. But if it were Mac, I knew I would face a judge who understood the meaning of duty, loyalty, and the profound responsibility of leadership. He would see through David's machinations. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor and her team were already working tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing my case. I reviewed my financial records, my medical history, anything that could potentially be used against me. I wanted to be prepared for every eventuality, every scurrying rat David might unleash from his dark burrow. I also took a long, hard look at David. What had driven him to this? Was it simple greed, a distorted sense of entitlement? Or was there something deeper, something rooted in our past, a resentment I'd never perceived? I thought back to his childhood, his adolescence, his young adulthood. He'd always been different from me. I was driven, focused, almost ruthlessly so. David was more artistic, more sensitive. Perhaps he'd felt overshadowed, unappreciated, despite my efforts to provide him with every opportunity. But still, this was an act of utter barbarism. It was a severance of the deepest human bonds, a calculated assault on the very foundation of family. The legal summons dictated a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt like an eternity. Each day a slow, agonizing march towards an unknown verdict. Sleep offered little respite, my dreams populated by distorted images of David, his face contorted with a greed I'd never seen before, and the stern, impassive gaze of a judge I hoped would be my salvation. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, bathed in the muted light of a cloudy November sky. The courthouse, a grand, imposing structure of granite and glass, seemed to absorb all the warmth from the air. As I walked through its echoing halls, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. This was uncharted territory, a battle waged not with balance sheets and market forecasts, but with legal briefs and the pronouncements of men in robes. Eleanor met me outside the courtroom, her expression a mask of calm professionalism. "Ready, Arthur?" I nodded, managing a tight smile. "As I'll ever be, Eleanor." We entered the courtroom, a hushed arena where whispers carried the weight of judgment. I scanned the faces in the gallery, a mix of lawyers, court staff, and a few curious onlookers. Then, my eyes fell upon the man on the bench. General Marcus Mac O'Connell. He looked older, his face etched with the years, but his eyes, those were the same eyes I remembered from the war. Sharp, observant, and carrying a depth of understanding that transcended mere legal knowledge. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze as he looked down at me, a subtle tightening around his lips that I interpreted as something more than mere professional courtesy. The proceedings began. David's attorney, a young man with an eager, almost predatory gleam in his eye, presented the case for my incapacitation. He spoke of my erratic behavior, citing a few minor instances that had been magnified and twisted into evidence of mental decline. He painted a picture of a man losing his grip, a danger to himself and his considerable fortune. It was a masterful performance, a carefully constructed narrative of decline. Then it was my turn. Eleanor rose, her voice clear and resonant. She presented my case, a meticulous dismantling of David's accusations. She brought forth witness testimonies, my financial advisors, my doctor, even a close personal friend who attested to my continued mental acuity and active engagement in my affairs. Throughout the proceedings, I felt Mac's gaze upon me. It wasn't an accusatory gaze, nor was it a sympathetic one. It was the gaze of a man assessing, evaluating, seeking the truth beneath the layers of legal argument and emotional appeals. There was a moment during David's attorney's closing remarks when he attempted to introduce a particularly damning piece of evidence, a misinterpreted conversation, a hasty email. Mac interrupted, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority. "Counsel," he said, his gaze fixed on the young lawyer, "this evidence, as presented, lacks context and appears to be selectively interpreted. I would remind you that the burden of proof rests with your client." The young lawyer stammered, his confidence visibly shaken. I felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement of the unwritten understanding that existed between Mac and me. He wasn't judging me based on David's flimsy accusations. He was judging the evidence and the integrity of the accuser. After what felt like an eternity, the judge retired to his chambers to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. I sat beside Eleanor, my hands clasped, trying to project an outward calm that belied the storm raging within me. David sat across the aisle, his face a mask of stoic indifference, though I detected a faint tremor in his hands. When Mac returned, the courtroom fell silent. He looked directly at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he began to speak. "This court has heard the arguments presented today. The petitioner, David Sterling, has sought to establish that Arthur Sterling is incapacitated and unable to manage his own affairs. The evidence presented by the petitioner is, in this court's assessment, insufficient to meet that high burden of proof." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before returning to me. "Arthur Sterling has demonstrated, through extensive documentation and compelling testimony, a clear understanding of his financial situation and a consistent engagement with his personal and professional responsibilities. The alleged instances of erratic behavior are, when viewed in their proper context, indicative of a man navigating the complexities of life and business, not succumbing to mental decline." He then addressed David directly. "Mr. Sterling, while the court acknowledges your concerns, the path you have chosen is one that carries significant personal and legal ramifications. It is never to be taken lightly to question the autonomy and mental capacity of another individual, especially a parent." The words hung in the air, a quiet pronouncement of justice. Mac's decision was clear and unambiguous. He had seen through David's ploy. "Therefore," Mac concluded, his voice resonating with finality, "this court hereby dismisses the petition for incapacitation. Arthur Sterling remains fully competent to manage his own affairs. Case dismissed." A wave of relief washed over me, so profound it felt almost physical. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Eleanor squeezed my arm, a triumphant smile gracing her lips. As the courtroom began to disperse, I rose and walked towards the bench. I wanted to thank Mac, not just as a judge, but as the man who had once shared foxhole stories with me, the man who understood the unspoken bonds of loyalty and honor. "Mac," I said, my voice thick with emotion as I stood before him, "thank you." He looked up at me, a hint of his old battlefield camaraderie in his eyes. He extended a hand. "Arthur, it's good to see you. Though I confess, the circumstances under which we meet again are regrettable." We shook hands, a firm, meaningful grip. "I owe you more than words can say," I added. He gave a slight nod. "We all have our battles, Arthur, and sometimes the most important ones are fought not on the battlefield, but within our own families." He paused, his gaze drifting towards David, who was gathering his papers with a strained expression. "This is a difficult lesson for your son, I imagine. A harsh reminder that respect and trust are earned, not inherited." I nodded, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the damage to my relationship with David might be irreparable. "He will learn," I said, more to myself than to Mac. "He has to learn." Leaving the courthouse, the November air felt strangely warmer, the sky a little less overcast. The ordeal was over, at least in the legal sense, but the emotional scars remained. David's actions had irrevocably altered the landscape of our family, leaving a chasm that might never be fully bridged. Eleanor walked with me to my car. "Arthur, what will you do now?" I looked back at the imposing courthouse, then towards the horizon where the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. "I'll rebuild," I said, my voice firm, "and I'll learn from this. I'll learn that sometimes the greatest threats come from the ones closest to us." The drive home was a somber one. The familiar surroundings of my estate, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt tinged with a new, unsettling reality. My fortune had been targeted, and my son had been the perpetrator. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. The legal battle was won, but the war for my son's respect, and perhaps for his soul, was far from over. I had faced down external threats with clarity and resolve. Now I faced the challenge of confronting the damage within my own family, a battle that promised to be even more complex and perhaps even more heartbreaking. The memory of Mac's steady gaze, his commitment to justice, was a comforting anchor in the turbulent waters ahead. He had reminded me that even in the face of personal betrayal, integrity and loyalty could prevail, and that, more than any fortune, was a victory worth celebrating. The story of a son's greed and a judge's wisdom had played out, leaving me with a profound understanding of the fragility of trust and the enduring strength of old loyalties. The fight was far from over, but for now I was free to continue building the life I had earned, with a clear mind and a renewed sense of purpose. And as I looked out at the familiar, yet changed, landscape, I knew that the lessons learned in that courtroom and the quiet understanding shared with an old army buddy would guide me through whatever lay ahead. The sun, finally breaking through the clouds, cast a hopeful, albeit bittersweet, light on the path forward. The victory in court, though hard won, left a hollow ache in its wake. The legal battle had been a necessary shield, deflecting David's egregious attack, but the emotional aftermath was a landscape of shattered trust and profound disappointment. The granite and glass edifice of the courthouse, which had moments before represented a bastion of justice, now felt like a stark reminder of the deep rift that had opened between me and my only son. Returning to the quiet solitude of my study, the polished mahogany desk no longer seemed an immaculate surface. It was a battlefield, scarred by the phantom imprint of that summons, and now by the stark reality of my son's ambition. The air, once filled with the comforting scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, now carried a faint, lingering bitterness. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, had immediately suggested damage control. Arthur, while Mac's ruling is definitive, David's actions have undoubtedly raised questions, even if unfounded. We need to manage the narrative. Manage the narrative? I scoffed, the word tasting like ash. Eleanor, my son attempted to have me declared legally insane. There's no managing that. There is mitigating it, she corrected, her tone firm but gentle. We can release a statement, reiterating your continued fitness to manage your affairs, perhaps highlighting the unfounded nature of the petition. It's a standard procedure. I considered her words. Standard procedure. My life had been a series of deviations from the standard, a relentless pursuit of the exceptional. But perhaps, in this instance, a touch of the conventional was necessary. Very well, Eleanor. Draft something. But it needs to be firm. Unyielding. The statement, when released, was concise and factual, emphasizing the court's validation of my competence. It was met with a predictable ripple of interest in the business world, quickly subsumed by the ever-churning news cycle. But for me, it was a fragile dam against a rising tide of disquiet. The days that followed were a study in contrasts. Professionally, I threw myself back into my work with renewed ferocity. The legal victory had been a powerful affirmation of my capabilities, a stark counterpoint to David's desperate claims. I initiated a new international venture, a bold move into emerging markets that demanded my full attention and strategic acumen. My colleagues rallied around me, their support a welcome balm. They had witnessed my resilience firsthand, and my defiance of David's accusations only cemented their respect. Yet, in the quiet hours of the evening, the silence of my home pressed in. The portraits on the walls, once warm reminders of shared history, now seemed to mock me with their frozen smiles. I found myself replaying conversations with David, searching for clues, for the nascent signs of the resentment that had festered beneath the surface. Had I been too demanding? Too absent? Had my ambition, so vital to my own sense of self, inadvertently choked his spirit? The artistic inclinations I'd always recognized in him, his early love for sketching, his fascination with music, had often been overshadowed by my focus on tangible financial achievements. I'd encouraged them, of course, provided him with the finest tutors and instruments, but had I truly understood their intrinsic value to asterisk him? Or had I merely viewed them as acceptable diversions, a softer counterpoint to the hard-edged reality of my own world? One evening, while sifting through old photographs, I came across a candid shot of David from his teenage years. He was laughing, his eyes bright with a youthful idealism that now seemed impossibly distant. In his hands he held a worn copy of a poetry anthology, a stark contrast to the sleek, business-oriented texts that filled my own bookshelves. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. I had been so focused on building a dynasty, on perpetuating a legacy, that I had perhaps failed to nurture the individual who was meant to inherit it. This introspection, however, did not translate into immediate reconciliation. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. I couldn't simply sweep David's actions under the rug of familial duty. There had to be accountability. There had to be an understanding of the gravity of his transgression. A week after the hearing, I received a cryptic email from Eleanor. Arthur, David's former personal assistant, a Ms. Clara Jenkins, has contacted my office. She wishes to speak with us. Confidentiality assured. Clara Jenkins, a name I vaguely recalled as someone who had worked for David for a few years before abruptly resigning. Her initiative was unexpected. I instructed Eleanor to arrange a meeting, not at my office, nor at hers, but at a neutral, discreet location. The stakes were too high to risk any further missteps. We met in a quiet corner booth at an upscale hotel lounge, the low murmur of conversation providing a veneer of anonymity. Clara, a young woman with sharp, observant eyes and an air of quiet determination, arrived promptly. She was visibly nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Vance," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Please, call me Arthur," I said, my tone as reassuring as I could manage. "And thank you for reaching out, Clara. Eleanor has assured me of your discretion." She nodded, taking a deep breath. I felt I had to say something. What David did, it wasn't right. It wasn't just about the money, was it? Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Clara, we understand your concern. Arthur's competence has been affirmed by the court. However, we are interested in understanding the motivations behind David's actions. If you have information that might shed light on this, it would be invaluable." Clara's story unfolded, a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, manipulation, and a chillingly effective exploitation of my son's insecurities. She spoke of David's increasing obsession with wealth and power, a desire that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing year. He had confided in her, she revealed, his resentment towards me bubbling to the surface in bitter diatribes. "He felt overshadowed," Clara explained, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and disdain. "He said you never truly saw him, not the real him. He believed you saw him as a disappointment, a failed imitation of yourself." The words stung, each one a fresh barb. "He believed this?" I asked, my voice tight. "He did," Clara confirmed. "And he became convinced that the only way to prove himself, to escape your shadow, was to gain control of what you valued most, your empire. He saw you as a barrier, and the incapacitation petition was his perceived solution." Quote. She then revealed a crucial detail. David had been working with a financial advisor, a man named Victor Thorne, who had been subtly, insidiously feeding his ambition and manipulating him. Thorne, Clara explained, had been the architect of the legal strategy, devising ways to gather evidence of my alleged mental decline, often by twisting innocent events into malicious intent. Mr. Thorne convinced David that this was the only way to protect the family legacy, Clara continued. "He painted a picture of you as being reckless, of your decisions jeopardizing everything you'd built. And David, desperate for validation and convinced by Thorne's arguments, believed it." The revelation about Thorne was significant. I'd never encountered him professionally, but the description of his tactics resonated with the calculated ruthlessness I'd seen in the business world. He was a predator, and David, in his desperate hunger for approval, had become his prey. "And the financial gain?" I pressed. Clara's gaze met mine, unwavering. "Mr. Thorne made it clear to David that once you were declared incapacitated, he would be instrumental in restructuring the company, ensuring wise management of your assets. The implication was lucrative arrangements for those involved in the process. David was promised a significant stake, and Thorne a substantial fee for his services. This was more than just familial discord. It was a calculated conspiracy, orchestrated by a third party who had expertly exploited my son's vulnerabilities. The anger I had felt towards David began to morph, tinged with a cold, hard fury directed at Thorne. "Thank you, Clara," I said, my voice measured. "Your honesty is appreciated. And your courage in coming forward is commendable." I turned to Eleanor. "Eleanor, please ensure Ms. Jenkins is compensated for her time and any inconvenience, and explore any legal avenues against Mr. Thorne for his involvement. Misrepresentation, conspiracy, perhaps even attempted fraud." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glinting with a familiar determination. "Consider it done, Arthur." As Clara left, a sense of grim purpose settled over me. The legal victory had been a defensive maneuver. Now I needed to go on the offensive. Not just against David, but against the architect of his downfall. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and her team, armed with Clara's testimony, delved into Victor Thorne's operations. They unearthed a pattern of similar predatory behavior, a history of preying on vulnerable individuals and manipulating them into ceding control of their assets. Thorne was a ghost in the financial world, a phantom who left a trail of broken lives and depleted fortunes in his wake. The evidence against Thorne was substantial. He had actively encouraged David's delusions, provided him with legal and financial justifications for his actions, and stood to gain immensely from my incapacitation. This was not simply a son rebelling against a father. It was a sophisticated financial scheme, cleverly disguised as a family dispute. I knew I couldn't let this stand. The legal battle with David had been agonizing, a deeply personal tragedy, but allowing Thorn to continue his predatory practices would be a dereliction of my own sense of duty, not just to myself, but to others who might fall prey to his machinations. I contacted General O'Connell again, not to discuss the legalities of the case, but for a more personal conversation. I needed the perspective of a man who understood the broader implications of integrity, of loyalty, and of the courage it took to stand against corruption. We met for lunch at a quiet, unassuming diner, a far cry from the opulent restaurants we'd once frequented. Mac, looking every bit the distinguished elder statesman, seemed unfazed by my recounting of Thorn's machinations. "Arthur," he said after I'd finished, his gaze steady, "you've fought this battle with the precision of a seasoned commander. But now, you face a different kind of enemy. Not one of flesh and blood in the traditional sense, but a parasite, feeding on the weaknesses of others." "And what is the strategy, Mac?" I asked, leaning back in the booth. "How do you defeat a ghost?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You don't defeat a ghost by chasing it, Arthur. You expose it. You shine a light on its shadowy corners. Thorn thrives in secrecy, in the manipulation of perception. Your victory in court, though a personal one, has already begun that process." "But David," I began, the familiar ache resurfacing. Mac held up a hand. "David is a casualty, Arthur, a tragic one. He made a choice, a poor one, influenced by external forces. But his future is not yet written in stone. This experience, however brutal, might be the crucible he needs to forge his own character." He then spoke about his own experiences in Vietnam, of the moral compromises and the ethical lines blurred under the pressures of war. He emphasized the importance of not letting personal vendettas cloud judgment, but of seeking justice for the broader good. "Thorn's actions are not just an attack on you, Arthur," Max stated. "They are an attack on the very principles of fairness and trust that our society relies upon. You have the resources, the intellect, and now a clear understanding of the enemy. Use them wisely." His words were a powerful affirmation, a call to action that resonated with my own sense of purpose. I had won the battle for my autonomy, but the larger war against corruption and the more intimate war for my son's understanding was still ongoing. The next phase of my plan was not to file another lawsuit, but to leverage my influence and resources to expose Victor Thorn. I began discreetly gathering information, working with Eleanor's team to compile a comprehensive dossier on Thorn's activities. We documented his history, his modus operandi, and the clear pattern of exploitation. This information was then strategically leaked to select investigative journalists, individuals known for their integrity and their tenacity in uncovering financial malfeasance. The goal was not to litigate in the press, but to create a groundswell of public awareness, to strip Thorn of his anonymity and expose his predatory practices to the light. The response was not immediate, but it was significant. As the stories began to surface, detailing Thorn's alleged manipulations and the devastating impact on his clients, his carefully constructed reputation began to crumble. Lawsuits, previously stifled by NDAs and intimidating legal threats, began to emerge from the shadows. Thorn, accustomed to operating in clandestine circles, found himself under unprecedented scrutiny. Meanwhile, I also initiated a more personal campaign, albeit a silent one. I didn't confront David directly, nor did I demand apologies. Instead, I began to subtly re-engage with his world. I funded a new arts foundation in his name, one dedicated to supporting emerging artists and fostering creative expression. I made a significant donation to a charitable organization focused on mental health awareness, a cause he had shown a nascent interest in during his college years. It was a deliberate strategy of demonstrating, not demanding. I wanted to show him that my love and respect were not contingent on him mirroring my own path, but on his own personal growth and well-being. I wanted to offer him an olive branch, not as a gesture of weakness, but as an invitation to a different kind of relationship, one built on genuine understanding and mutual respect. The initial response from David was, predictably, guarded. He acknowledged the foundation and the donation through intermediaries, his responses polite but distant. He remained entrenched in his resentment, perhaps still influenced by Thorn's insidious counsel, or perhaps simply grappling with the shame and guilt of his actions. However, the exposure of Victor Thorn began to have an effect. As Thorn's empire began to unravel, as his legal entanglements grew and his reputation soured, David's isolation from his former advisor must have become increasingly apparent. The man who had promised him power and validation was now a pariah. One afternoon, months after the preliminary hearing, an unexpected visitor arrived at my estate. It was David. He stood on the manicured lawn, looking hesitant, almost lost. He was dressed in casual clothes, a stark contrast to the sharp suits he'd favored during the legal proceedings. I met him at the front door, my heart a complicated mix of apprehension and cautious optimism. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with years of hurt and misunderstanding. "David," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. He met my gaze, his own eyes clouded with a myriad of emotions, regret, shame, and perhaps a flicker of the idealism I'd seen in that old photograph. "Father," he replied, his voice quiet. We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy between us. The polished mahogany desk, the summons, the courtroom, all the recent battles seemed to recede into the background, replaced by the raw, human need for connection. I made a mistake, Father," he finally stammered, his gaze dropping to the ground. "A terrible mistake. Thorn. He was so convincing. He made me believe." I stepped forward, not to embrace him, but to stand beside him, a silent offering of support. "I know, David, he preyed on your vulnerabilities. He exploited your ambition." He looked up then, tears welling in his eyes. "It was wrong. Everything was wrong. I almost destroyed everything." "You almost destroyed yourself," I corrected gently. "But you didn't. And neither did I." The conversation that followed was not a grand resolution, not a magical erasure of past grievances. It was a beginning. A tentative step towards mending what had been broken. We spoke of the past, of his childhood, of my own shortcomings as a father. We acknowledged the pain, the resentment, and the fear that had driven his actions. The exposure of Victor Thorn had been a necessary catalyst, a force that had stripped away the deception and revealed the true cost of unchecked ambition. It had also, in its own way, created a space for a different kind of dialogue, a chance to rebuild on a foundation of honesty, however painful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the estate, David stood to leave. The chasm between us had not miraculously vanished, but the first tentative bridges had been built. I'm sorry, Father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that felt both familiar and profoundly new. "I know, son, and I'm sorry, too." The legal battle was over. Victor Thorn was facing the consequences of his actions. The world of business would continue to churn, but my immediate focus had shifted. The greatest challenge, the most enduring legacy, was not in building empires, but in nurturing the fractured bonds of family. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with the potential for missteps and setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that the echoes of betrayal could eventually give way to the quiet murmur of reconciliation. The fight was far from over, but the true battle, the one for my son's heart and for the soul of our family, had just begun. And this time I was ready to face it, not with legal briefs and financial projections, but with a renewed understanding of the enduring strength found in vulnerability and the quiet power of forgiveness. The lessons learned from old army buddies and the painful realities of family warfare had forged a new perspective, a deeper understanding of what truly constituted victory. The lingering scent of regret in the air, a subtle counterpoint to the polished mahogany and worn leather of my study, signaled a new phase. David's visit, brief and weighted with unspoken apologies, had been a fragile opening. The "I'm sorry, Father," and my reciprocal "I'm sorry, too" were not resolutions. but the tentative first steps across a vast emotional minefield. The victory in court, the exposure of Victor Thorne, the tentative reconnection with my son, these were the tremors that followed a seismic event, rearranging the landscape of my life. The immediate aftermath of Thorne's exposure was a whirlwind. Eleanor, with her usual efficiency, ensured that the carefully compiled dossier reached the right hands. Investigative journalists, spurred by the mounting evidence and the growing chorus of Thorne's disgruntled former clients, began to weave their narratives. Thorne, once a ghost in the financial machine, found himself illuminated by the harsh glare of public scrutiny. His carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbled under the weight of accusations of conspiracy, manipulation, and outright fraud. Lawsuits, previously dormant, were reawakened, their plaintiffs emboldened by the unfolding scandal. The financial world, a place where reputation was currency, began to divest from Thorne, leaving him increasingly isolated, his empire built on sand now battered by an unforgiving tide. Professionally, the affair with Thorne and David's misguided involvement, while deeply personal, had also inadvertently bolstered my standing. My resilience, my swift and decisive response to the threat, had been witnessed by my colleagues and the wider business community. The narrative, which Eleanor had so astutely identified as crucial, had been rewritten. I was no longer merely a successful businessman. I was a man who had weathered an unprecedented storm and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The international venture I'd launched continued its upward trajectory, my focus sharpened by the recent trials. The challenges it presented, the complexities of navigating emerging markets, offered a welcome distraction from the emotional reverberations of the family drama. Yet the quiet hours remained the most demanding. While my professional life hummed with renewed vigor, my personal one was a work in progress, a delicate reconstruction. David's visits became more frequent, though still punctuated by silences and hesitant exchanges. We moved beyond the initial apologies, tentatively probing the depths of our shared past. I began to understand the suffocating weight of expectation he'd felt, the constant comparison to a father who, in his eyes, had prioritized ambition over presence. My own narrative, too, began to surface, the relentless drive that had propelled me forward, a drive born not just of ambition, but of a deep-seated fear of failure, a fear I'd rarely allowed myself to acknowledge. One evening, he brought a sketchbook to my study. The pages were filled with intricate charcoal drawings, landscapes that captured a raw, untamed beauty, and portraits that hinted at a profound understanding of human emotion. It was a stark reminder of the artistic inclinations I'd often relegated to the periphery of my own life. I've been working on these," he said, his voice soft, avoiding my direct gaze. "For a new gallery opening. Eleanor helped me secure a space." Eleanor, in her quiet, inimitable way, had been a constant facilitator of this fragile reconciliation. She'd recognized the need for shared ground, for a neutral space where my son could express himself without the shadow of my expectations. "They're remarkable, David," I said, genuinely awestruck. The depth of his talent, the subtle nuances of light and shadow, spoke of a sensitivity I had, perhaps, underestimated. "You have a gift." His shoulders relaxed slightly, a subtle shift in his posture that spoke volumes. You used to draw, didn't you, when you were younger?" The question caught me off guard. It had been decades since I'd picked up a pencil with any serious intent. The demands of building an empire, the relentless pursuit of financial security, had eclipsed such creative endeavors. A long time ago, I admitted. "The realities of life, I suppose, steer us in different directions." "Or we let them," he replied, his gaze now steady, meeting mine. There was no accusation in his tone, only a quiet observation. This was the crux of it, wasn't it? The choices we make, the paths we allow ourselves to stray from. I realized then that my own artistic inclinations, however suppressed, were a part of me, a part I'd allowed to wither in the pursuit of what I deemed more important. The conversation that followed was not about Thorn or the legal battles. It was about a shared passion, a bridge built across the chasm of our estrangement. We spoke of artists whose work we admired, of the power of visual storytelling, of the catharsis that creation could offer. It was a conversation stripped of agenda, of underlying motives, a simple exchange between two men rediscovering a common language. The exposure of Victor Thorn had, in a strange way, created a void. His manipulative presence, the architect of our discord, was gone. This void, however painful the circumstances of its creation, allowed for a different kind of space to emerge. It was a space where genuine connection, stripped of external pressures and fabricated narratives, could begin to take root. General O'Connell, or Mac as I now affectionately called him, remained a steady presence. Our lunches, once filled with discussions of strategy and leadership, now often veered into the philosophical. He'd seen his own share of battles, both on the battlefield and in the quieter, more insidious conflicts of life. "You know, Arthur," he'd said over a shared plate of shepherd's pie at that unassuming diner, "the most difficult victories are often the ones fought within. The external skirmishes are often easier to navigate than the internal ones." His words resonated deeply. The legal victory, the exposure of Thorn, were indeed external. But the real victory, the one that held the true promise of lasting peace, was the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding trust with my son, of understanding the man he had become, and perhaps of allowing myself to become the father he needed. "David's progress is encouraging, Mac," I confessed, "but the scars are deep, for both of us." Mac nodded, his gaze steady. "Scars are not signs of weakness, Arthur. They are proof that we have healed. And healing, especially from something like this, is rarely a swift process. It requires patience, a willingness to revisit the wounds, but to do so with the intention of tending to them, not reopening them." He spoke of the importance of acknowledging the pain, of validating the hurt, but of not allowing it to define the future. "You can't erase what happened, Arthur. But you can choose how you move forward. You can choose to let the past be a burden, or you can choose to let it be a lesson." His counsel, as always, was a grounding force. It reminded me that the pursuit of justice, while vital, could not overshadow the human element. My focus, I realized, needed to shift from retribution to restoration. The international venture continued to expand, requiring my full attention. I'd invested heavily in a new renewable energy initiative in a developing country, a project that aligned with my long-held belief in sustainable progress. The challenges were immense: navigating complex political landscapes, securing vital resources, and building local partnerships. But the inherent difficulties of the endeavor provided a tangible focus, a sense of purpose that transcended the personal. It was during a crucial phase of this venture, a high-stakes negotiation with a foreign government, that I received a call from Eleanor. Her voice, usually calm and measured, held a note of urgency. "Arthur, Victor Thorn has been apprehended." The news, though anticipated, still sent a jolt through me. Thorn, it turned out, had attempted to flee the country, but his elaborate plans had been thwarted by the combined efforts of several financial regulatory agencies, acting on the intelligence we'd provided. "And David?" I asked, my mind immediately going to my son. Had Thorn's downfall had any effect on him? He's doing well," Eleanor replied, a slight pause before her answer. "He's been exceptionally involved with the Arts Foundation. They're opening a new exhibition next month. He's been very engaged with the artists." The information was a quiet reassurance. David was finding his footing, building something of his own, independent of my influence or Thorn's machinations. This was the true victory, the blossoming of his own identity. The legal battles and the subsequent exposure of Thorn were, in many ways, the necessary storm before the calm. The storm had raged, and in its wake it had cleared the air, exposing the rot that had been festering beneath the surface. It had forced a confrontation with truths that had been long buried, and in that confrontation, a path towards healing had emerged. The legacy I sought to build was not solely an economic one. It was also a legacy of integrity, of resilience, and of the enduring strength of family bonds, however fractured. The pursuit of wealth and influence, while a driving force in my life, had also at times blinded me to the more profound aspects of human connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the estate began to turn vibrant shades of red and gold, David arrived unannounced, not with a sketchbook this time, but with a small, elegantly wrapped package. "Father," he began, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, I wanted to give you something." He handed me the package. Inside was a beautifully crafted silver fountain pen, its inscription subtle and deeply personal. "To the man who taught me the art of perseverance and the courage to write my own story." Tears pricked at my eyes, a rare and unexpected occurrence. This was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was an offering of understanding, a recognition of the lessons learned, both from my successes and my failures. "David," I said, my voice thick with emotion, this means more to me than you can imagine." He offered a tentative smile, the kind that reached his eyes and banished the lingering shadows. "We still have a lot to talk about, Father, but I think we're starting to." And he was right. We did. The journey of reconciliation was far from over. There would be more conversations, more shared silences, more tentative steps forward. But as I held the pen, its cool metal, a grounding sensation in my palm, I felt a profound sense of peace. The hard-won victory in court had indeed left an ache, but it was an ache that was slowly, surely, being replaced by the quiet hum of hope, by the promise of a future where family, not fortune, was the true measure of success. The echoes of betrayal were fading, replaced by the gentle murmur of reconciliation, a melody that, for the first time in a long time, felt like home. The lessons of war, both literal and metaphorical, had taught me that true strength lay not in the absence of vulnerability, but in the courage to confront it, to heal it, and to ultimately rebuild upon it. The battle for my son's heart, and for the soul of our family, was not a fight I could win with legal maneuvers or financial leverage, but with the quiet, persistent power of understanding and forgiveness. And in that I finally felt like a true commander, leading my most important campaign to date. The polished mahogany desk no longer felt like a battlefield, but a place where a new chapter, written with a silver pen, was finally beginning. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco was now tinged with a hopeful new fragrance, the subtle aroma of healing and the promise of a future, one that we would write together, sentence by careful sentence. The landscape of shattered trust was slowly, painstakingly being replanted with seeds of understanding, watered by shared vulnerability and the enduring power of love. The granite and glass edifice of the courthouse, once a symbol of conflict, now represented the turning point, the crucible in which our relationship was being reforged, stronger and more resilient than before.